I'm delighted to welcome another guest on our Leading Dialogues podcast. I'm delighted to introduce to you Sister Sheila Curran, who is a member of the Congregation of the Sisters of Mercy, the Northern Branch here in Ireland. She also holds a Master's in Equality Studies at the UCD here in Dublin, and in Biblical Ministry at the Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. She got that in 2011. And she also has a doctorate of ministry from that same Catholic Theological Union. And so you'll see she's a very distinguished guest. In addition to that, she lived in Peru for many years, ministering in a shanty town in the outskirts of the city of Lima, and while also, of course, working in the Institute of Bartolomé de las Casas, which is a social justice and human rights non-governmental organization founded by the liberation theologian Gustavo Gutiérrez. She was working alongside him and developed a deep understanding of liberation theology as a result. At present, Sister Sheila works as an eco-feminist liberation theologian and a social justice and civil rights advocate, and her interdisciplinary approach, not only to theology, but also the interface between life experience and what she describes as the biblical world. So she currently works with migrants and refugees in the city of Dublin, while also giving courses, retreats, conferences in Ireland and also internationally. So welcome, if I may call you Sheila.
Thank you. Thank you, Swami. Thank you for inviting me to be part of your podcast.
All good. Well, I'm going to start with a question that we didn't actually pose to you, and that is that recently you gave a document, Budget Choices, for 2027 to the government. And I just wondered if you could give me a brief background and what the contents were and what the aims were of making such a document.
Well, I'm a board member of a group called Social Justice Ireland, and Social Justice Ireland is an organisation. It was originally founded by two religious people called Sean Healy and Bridget Reynolds as part of the Justice Office of the Conference of Religious in Ireland for many years. It's now an independent organisation run by a group of lay people, which has always looked at structural justice issues in Ireland. Every year for the last 35 years, I'd say, if not more, it always has produced a document coming up to the budget in Ireland. So it analyses the government's finances, where the government has been using its finances, and it makes proposals on how to work for a more fairer and just Ireland. So under every part of the government's programme, like whether it is social welfare, the environment, rural and urban divide, all of those issues and how they could use both taxation differently, proposing it's costed, financed, showing how taxation could be more fair in the light of creating a more equal and just Ireland. So it's quite a heavy document. It's always reviewed and analysed by other economists. But it does put forward a very different way in which the government could be using its resources. Of course, as you know, Ireland is quite a rich country, very much a rich country, and it's holding the presidency of the EU at the moment. And that's a very big moment for us in the country. And so the proposals are even more radical in the light of what we could be setting out. And it's used by other groups as a lobby document on their areas that they may work, specific organizations like housing or social welfare or whatever may use the document and its materials to lobby for their clientele as well. So that's what it is. It's produced every year. And then after the budget, we analyze the budget in the light of the proposal and what the budget may or may not have achieved.
And in the past, has it had a positive impact? Has it been taken into consideration seriously and implemented?
Yes, but It depends on the governments, as you know, like the political parties. Some political parties take aspects of it very seriously because it is costed, it is researched. Other parties may not be in agreement because their emphasis is on creating more wealth or whatever in the light of how that wealth is. Like Ireland's taxation policy is not a good taxation policy. Most of our taxation comes from global investment, particularly through the IT sector or through the data research, the data centers and all of that. So most of our of the big money we have comes from taxation, like to companies like Google, or like Meta, and all of these companies. So they look at a different way in which we could have more equal taxation, more taxing of the very wealthy, more equal distribution of wealth, not just through the PAYE sector. So I mean, it always depends, but some things have been taken seriously, like the basic income, looking for a basic income which has been implemented for some people in the arts in Ireland. Social Justice Ireland pioneered the basic income about 30 years ago as a way in which it could create a different type of economy in Ireland.
Hmm.
You have to keep lobbying, you have to keep going.
Yes, yes. I mean, all of this is really under the remit, if you want to call it that, the kind of drive and purpose of the Congregation of Sisters of Mercy. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the foundation of that in the 19th century. And the founder, I think she's been elevated to venerable, as far as I understand. And how widespread the congregation is internationally.
Well, the Sisters of Mercy were founded by a woman called Catherine McAuley, a Dublin woman, and she was in her 40s. She used her inheritance to, she was a woman that, I mean, she has a very, very interesting history. It would take you all day to go through her history because she was orphaned. She lived with a family who were Quakers, and they give her the wealth when she was orphaned with her brothers, and when they died, she got the wealth, which was a house in Coolock. It's a house owned now by the Sisters of Mercy still, out in a place called Coolock, which would have been a poorer area of Dublin, but would have been a rural area of Dublin back in the day. She didn't set out to found a congregation. It wasn't her aim. Like, she was Catholic, but she didn't set out necessarily to found a religious order. She, with other women, two other women in particular, set out to help the needs of the poor and disenfranchised in Ireland of that time, particularly women and children, where she saw that women were being abused in some of the big grand houses of Dublin, and had no other skill set to which they could have find employment, and the children who were poor were not getting educated. People who were sick were not in places to be cared for, because Dublin was a very, very impoverished place. Ireland was very impoverished. It was a very impoverished country, and particularly after the Civil War and because of the famine and all of that. But anyway, when she had that wealth, she bought a property in Baggot Street in Dublin, and she opened a House of Mercy in 1827. But Ireland was a very, very Catholic country and very dominated by the hierarchy. So the bishop did not particularly like that these women were running this place, and I mean, for all these poor people to come into, and more or less encouraged her to become a religious. So she joined the Presentation Sisters for 3 years to have that formation, and she and the two other women with her founded the Sisters of Mercy in 1831. And the House of Mercy was opened. Baggot Street was the first House of Mercy. Our structure at that time was that when there was a need, other women joined her. Other people we were the first congregation in Ireland that did not have what they call cloister. Most religious congregations were enclosed, or they didn't go out in the streets. These were known as the walking nuns. They went around the city of Dublin seeking out the poor and the sick, particularly. There was, of course, a cholera pandemic, so they attended to the needs, and some of the sisters contacted cholera and died. But every place then that saw these sisters looked for more members in Ireland and in Britain at that time. And they sent two or three sisters to respond to that need. Wherever there were some Irish priests, these sisters, so they founded their own foundations. They were independent once they grew. The congregation grew quite extensively, and it would have been the congregation when I joined the Sisters of Mercy. I was 20 in 1981. We were 4,500 sisters in Ireland alone. Needless to say, that demographic has changed
Yes, yes.
radically since then. But our congregation still is quite a large congregation. It is very much,
I think it's about 5,000 at the moment. Is that correct?
and we are in Ireland, England, the Americas, Africa, particularly Kenya, South Africa, and Nigeria, Asia, and Australia.
How did you get to Peru then?
We had, I worked, like as you know, I worked both in Belfast and in Dublin, and at that time we were looking for people to respond to the needs in South America, and we merged into one congregation in 1994. So there was a call out for people to respond to the needs to go to Peru and South America. I had always been, from I was very young, a member of a support group for Latin America, because when I worked in Belfast, the needs of, like, at that time in the 80s in Latin America, it was a lot of dictatorships, there was a lot of violence, there were a lot of people killed, including religious women and men. And so we were very much on the grounds of inequality and injustice. So I thought I would go to Peru. So I went to Peru in 1995. And we had three missions in Peru. We were also part of the larger Mercy group because there were mercies from the Americas, there were mercies from Australia and New Zealand, as well as mercies from England and Ireland. We were 56 Mercy sisters in Peru at the time I went there. Needless to say, we're only about 11 Mercy sisters in Peru at this time.
Right. I mean, I can't help thinking around the time of the formation, as it were, of your congregation. Actually, a bit later, our the order of monks founded by Swami Vivekananda was very different because, again, it was responding really to the needs in India of the poorest of the poor. And it was Sister Nivedita from Ireland, from Dungannon, who was very much at the center of upliftment of women in India and of establishing schools. Because I think it's true to say, though, that in Catherine's time, there would have been the education system would have been dominated by the Church of Ireland. Would that be correct?
Well, Ireland was occupied by Britain, and the dominance, there wasn't Catholic emancipation, like until we had Catholics were oppressed and therefore could not, witness to their faith freely at that time. And it was particularly Protestantism would have been the order of the day. Like Catherine was reared by both a Protestant and Quaker family. But the needs of more, because Ireland was very, very impoverished, like it was Catholics who couldn't own land, they couldn't own their own house, they didn't have access to education. Healthcare was, relatively scarce. We founded a lot of hospitals here at that time. Um, as with other religious orders of the time, the Catholics were so impoverished, and therefore the response, for that need became a very growing thing. But it was also that the state did not take on its responsibility.
Right, right.
The state has not taken on its responsibilities. And even though there are scandals associated with my order around orphanages, mother and baby homes, or things called Magdalene laundries, when they're taken out of their context and taken out of the context of what happens to people who are poor, and when institutionalization and how people are seen in a particular period of time, it gets a bit warped. It doesn't mean to say that things were not right, but it also doesn't give the fully fledged picture of the demand and needs and the lack of resourcing, but also how women were viewed, women who had children out of wedlock, women who had children, in all sorts of circumstances, not only through abuse, but, through the abuse of power of men who would have been very wealthy, didn't want their children known. I mean, this is all over the world, but at that time, the structure was very much an oppressed structure in Ireland, as I say, because of the male dominant hierarchical vision of church.
Mm.
But it means today also we still have people who are impoverished. We still have the poor who do not get their rights. We still have a very unequal system. So things haven't leveled out, despite the scandals, despite everything we say. We know, and you live in Ireland, that there is great inequality and that there is great need, and people who are homeless, or children who are homeless on the streets of Dublin or any other big town in Ireland, still exists.
Well, that kind of brings me then to the next thing, and that is what, in your view, would be the key issues now in terms of social justice and human rights in Ireland as such?
Well, one of the biggest ones, and it's not just in Ireland, it's across the EU generally, is housing and homelessness. How come we are such a wealthy country that we had stopped building social housing, affordable rental housing for people, that people cannot find a home? Even people who are earning reasonably good salaries cannot get a mortgage. That is a scandal. It's a scandal to how we are living, because you need a place to live. Everybody needs a place to live with dignity and respect. So
And I
that's
suppose, particularly in Ireland, where historically land ownership and domestic ownership was not available historically, or was denied even. Yeah. Mm.
So that's one of the biggest issues of all time. People cannot find a place to live, and that the most of the housing is controlled by the private sector, who are making huge, huge profit, and that is a moral question. It's a moral question for anybody, regardless, of a faith tradition. There's also a huge issue around changing landscape of the population of Ireland. Ireland would have been, for most of my growing up period of time, Eurocentric, white, mainly white people in Ireland, mostly Christian, give or take some of the Jewish population, a few maybe, other religions like Muslims that might have come in to study, mainly people who came of another culture and of another color to Ireland were either, coming to study or holding, a research profile, generally speaking, broad stroke, not necessarily all the data. But that demographic changed from the latter part, probably the end of the 90s into the 2000s. And Ireland was no longer a place where people in my generation grew to leave the country, especially in the 80s, where there was huge unemployment and huge poverty. They were all coming to our country from all these countries. So there's a huge different demographic. You can stand now in Dublin, you can hear accents from all over the world. You have people from all different cultures. But how we manage that is an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for us to lead how we can manage that. And that is a serious question, because while there are incidences of racism, discrimination, Islamophobia, or any other, like whether it's anti-Semitic or whatever, they're quite low in relation to what's going on in other parts of Europe. But if we do not do something about that now and tackle it seriously and open spaces of real dialogue, as you know, what we tried to do in Dublin City Interfaith Forum, we will be down those roads of more serious problems. But it is a richness, and we know that from research from different groups that do the research, that most people in Ireland are not anti different diverse groups in their place.
Mm.
But there is a small percentage who have the louder voices in that space at the moment. So, as I say, it's how we really, really work hard to make sure that that little voice doesn't become the dominant voice.
And I suppose that minority is echoing supposed situations in UK and other parts of Europe, maybe. Um, and the issues of migration and refugees, which are two distinct things, but somehow are conflated in many people's minds. And one wonders what the key issues are currently for those people, in your
But
view.
also, if you're distant, like I come from Donegal, and there's a Mica crisis, for example, houses that were built with defective blocks, thousands and thousands of homes that people thought, my brother's one of them, that they had their home and that their mortgage is paid and that in their 60s now they can look towards retiring and whatever, and found that their houses were crumbling. So they are very angry because the person who made these blocks, the company who made these blocks, is not reprimanded. They're only given a small grant because the government will not take 100% responsibility for the fact that even though these houses were supervised under governmental law to be built correctly, were built incorrectly. So people with anger like that project their anger onto these groups that are coming as refugees because they think they're getting everything and these other people are getting nothing, when the responsibility lies with the government. And it suits the government to have a rhetoric that doesn't blame them. So you have to really work hard at projecting the right information. When people receive the correct information, the vulnerable group is not the target. It's the government needs to be the target. And that's the work that's really hard. It's how to get out different messaging, and it's how to ensure that the facts are given. And also when we challenge the government rhetoric, because some of our parliamentarians have been using that rhetoric to their advantage. Like just this week we had, since the new EU laws on migration have come in, that 9 out of 10 people have been turned away at our border. I mean, that is probably factually incorrect, but it makes a good headline. And
Right.
then people think, oh, this government's really tackling all these millions of people when we know there's less and less people coming to Ireland because they're experiencing homelessness, they're experiencing it difficult to get employment, they're experiencing, some of the hardships. So it's really difficult, but the work is how to get out proper messaging, which is groups like ours are trying to do, that we ensure that there's spaces for dialogue, there's spaces for correct information, and that the targeting of the lobbying and the targeting of the messaging goes to the correct sources, which is, lies with the government.
Are there lessons we can learn related to this in some way from what do you call the troubles in Northern Ireland?
Well, like we have a very delicate peace process in Northern Ireland. We have a very delicate peace process. And like the way migration is used as a buffer around the border, like I grew up in a border town, and I lived in Belfast during some of the worst periods of the Troubles. War doesn't achieve anything, and all wars end in dialogue. Doesn't matter how long it takes, all wars end in dialogue. But we also know that everybody has to be at the table for that dialogue. John Hume, and the man has gone to God, when he first started to have dialogue with the IRA, everybody villarized him because he maintained they had to be at the table. No more than the RUC, the DUP, whoever it was had to be at the table for peace to be achieved. And that you have to stay with the dialogue. You have to stay, you have to keep it going. It's not easy, it's not straightforward, but it is the only way to achieve peace. And that's what we have to ensure, that that dialogue space remains there and that it's worked at. Peace comes, but it has to be maintained. And to work for peace is an ongoing long-term project. So what we're learning from all that happened in the North, and to keep that peace, is truth-telling, justice, how to bring justice about. It's not revenge, how to get justice, how to know what happened at periods of time, what actually happened, how to do probably, reconciliation. That's not a term like that's all fluffy and, forgiveness and that, but you have to work hard to achieve that. And it comes with truth-telling, dialogue, and we are learning to keep that to the fore. And up until now, we have managed to keep the peace process going.
Well, that was my next question comment was, are there institutions or organized ways or mechanisms of doing exactly what you're saying?
There
I
are,
mean,
like, I mean,
there's,
there's the Shared Island Initiative, North and South. There is the religious organizations to which we're all a part, when they bring together, because some of the really good work for peace building has been brought by people of faith, faith groups coming together, centres like Coramelia in Northern Ireland, and here in the Republic you have Glen Cree, and these have worked very hard to bring reconciliation and peace building. The government has the Shared Island Initiative, which it brings different, from different things like, investment, business, values, what values, like this is the EU project, even though Northern Ireland is in that delicate position because of Brexit, that it's not part of, England is not part of the EU, the UK is not part of the EU. So how do you maintain the values of, diversity, democracy? How do you safeguard these? And these are real questions in a world order and a global environment that's changing rapidly all the time.
Mm.
So yes, there are institutions, but we
Is
have
it
to keep
enough?
being there. We have to keep being in the spaces and keep asking for those spaces to be opened.
Yes.
Like, when we were at the last meeting that we had over in DCU, about, we were invited to hear Mairead McGuinness give a speech about, Brexit and the EU and what happened and how that dialogue, these are opportunity and spaces that we have to keep the dialogue going, to keep the spaces open, and to keep making sure that we don't go down the road to violence again.
Mm. One curiosity question, completely different. When the congregation of the Sisters of Mercy was founded as a congregation, they were given a monastic uniform, so to speak. And that doesn't seem to be the case. And I was just wondering, out of pure curiosity, why that is, why the break is there, and what advantages there would be in your specific work for not having the nun uniform, so to speak, or the habit, actually, I suppose. Yeah.
Well, the habits of congregations, including our own, they were all to do with a peasant dress at the time. Most congregations, took on what would have been a very simple dress at the time. And in Catherine McAuley's case, the uniform, especially the headgear, the veil and that, was because, like in the Catholic Church at the time, you could not go into the church without your head covered. So these veils that lots of religious orders, adapted at the time was to keep your head covered. And then there was a particular religious format, whether it was from French congregations to other Europeans, the style of dress, was to have your head covered, and then whatever was the dress at the time. And that stuck. It's like a bit like some of the bad theology in Catholic theology. You wonder, how does that stick so long when other things moved? And part of it was a control. It was a control of how women, because to be a woman, to look like a woman, and to operate as women, as it still is, for the Catholic Church, this divide between, because we do not have equality in the Catholic Church, it is a very difficult thing around dress, your body shape, your image, whatever. And to be stylish, was seen to be a mortal sin. But as congregations developed, particularly in Europe, a lot of them shed away those dresses and just used the ordinary dress of people of the day. Unfortunately, for some of the more conservative orders, there is that battle about bringing back in a religious habit, but you're very identifiable. If you were in Dublin back in the 70s, 80s, you saw floods of these people walking around Dublin. Everybody knew they were nuns.
Mm.
But today, nobody knows, unless you do wear a habit. And that has been always a running battle. For me personally, and for a lot of people like me in my group, is to be an ordinary person in the midst. And also that hierarchy, religious was seen as a step above humanity.
Yes.
A priest or a nun was seen as something that was a step above humanity.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that was never meant to be the case. That wasn't what my congregation was about. And like that crept in very much, within Irish society quite a lot. And even in Latin America, you would be very, very well respected. And while there is a sense of respect, that's for every human being to be respected, it's that divide that you were like as if you walked, kind of about 2 inches above the ground.
Well,
So
if I can
the way
say,
with
we're
a
in
lot of
danger of
that.
that ourselves,
Yeah.
because, for example, in India, a Swami is, revered. They're called Maharaj.
Yeah.
Maharaj. The word Maharaj is used in three contexts. A cook is called Maharaj. Of course, a Maharaj, a king, is called that, and a sannyasin, a renunciant, is also called that.
Mm.
And people are surprised. They go to America, for example, and they see most of our Swamis dressed just in civilian dress, jeans, t-shirt, that kind of thing. And sometimes people get a culture shock who are not used to that. And only the head monk, if you will, would wear that. But of course, for formal ritualistic purposes, we for worship and communal prayer and meditation and so on, we use that. We wear that.
Mm.
But I got into trouble myself because when we go to Dungannon,
Mm.
where people are used to seeing the monks walking around in the Gero cloth,
Mm.
and there was a particular monk visiting, a well-known monk, Swami Chetananda, great author,
Mm.
and I took him to the airport, and he said, Swami Prabhavananda, one of the pioneers of the movement in America, used to say, outside the monastery, you don't wear anything to do with monks or anything. Inside the monastery, yes, but outside, no. And in France, for example, we have that very strict rule that if we step out of the monastic grounds, we do not wear anything to do with the monasteries or anything like that. We don't draw attention to ourselves. We have two kinds of groups of thinking. One is we dress deliberately like that so people ask us a question, who are you? And then we can do some kind of undercover missionary work. And the other would be just to not to draw attention to oneself, yeah. Mm.
Well, that would be kind of similar, the debates that go on. Like, people always would say to me, but I didn't know you were, you don't look like a nun. And I'd say, but what does a nun look like? And like nuns are really, the term nun is for enclosed sisters.
Yes,
Sisters are for those that are what we call an active, mission or,
yes,
eternal mission.
yes,
And the other side of it was that Catherine McAuley of her essence was to be with the people, walking alongside, accompanying the people on the ground. So
exactly.
it was never meant to have this divide of convents, structures that were so big,
Yes,
removed. That was part of how the Catholic Church established itself in Ireland very much.
yeah.
While in the changes that came about after Vatican II, which was a big revolution in the Catholic Church, was to change that structure. So people accompanied the people, lived like the people, were there amongst the people, were, carrying their pain, their struggles, especially those that were on the margins. And that's what forms our lives. Once you're rooted with the people that are most exploited in any culture, it tells you more about how a society is run. And
It makes all the sense in the world, yeah.
you grounded, and then they don't see you if you're not about trying to put yourself two steps above anybody, because we're only human beings. We're mortal, we're
Yeah.
flawed, and one of the things the scandals have brought us is into that where we get a lot of really bad rhetoric back now. Religion in Ireland doesn't have the same. What would you say? It's not, for a lot of people, religion's not important anymore, and
Right.
it's not that you want to dominate a religious discourse.
Yes.
But the values of, secularization and all these horrible things that money just achieves everything. You can buy whatever you want in the market. People are marketable. Life is marketable. The environment can be damaged in whatever way.
Mm.
Because that kind of push in the global world is really sad when our values around safeguarding our common home, the dignity and respect for every human being, and that everybody has a right to be able to live life with dignity.
And I suppose this really is what was behind this liberation theology, if we want to call that, of Gustavo Gutierrez,
Mm.
um, because I think, in my understanding, liberation theology, that term, was in many ways an anathema in the Catholic Church, and yet that stain never touched him, and quite legitimately he was all about the loving heart, I suppose, and the compassion for the poor and serving the needs of those poor people. Yeah.
Well, Gustavo was a diocesan priest originally in Peru. After the Vatican Council, the Vatican Council was this big revolution, where all the people came together. And one of the themes of the Vatican Council would have been the inequality in the world. But the West dominated that debate. So it was, church in the modern world, like, more about the industrialization of the modern world. But the bishops of Latin America, when they came back to their continent, they held a big meeting called Puebla and Medellin. These conference of bishops came together to say, how does Vatican II implement itself in our continent? And it was a very unequal continent. It was 90% Christian, but very unequal. So people like Gustavo, who was a young theologian, with people like Leonardo Boff, John Sobrino, they had studied in Europe. They had studied in France. They studied under a very famous Catholic theologian called Chenu and Karl Rahner. And they came back and they said, well, that's all very fine for them over there in this different type of world. What does this theology mean here in this continent, where there are great gaps between rich and poor? And that wasn't enough to give charity to the poor. The way these terms, well, the poor you will always have with you, or, give alms, Poor people are poor because there is a reason why they are poor. There is a structural way in which people are kept poor. So that was the beginning. They used Marxist theory, the way Marx was all about, this thing about. So that was a big thing at the time. So they were going around talking about structural injustice as a sin.
Mm.
That the poor are not poor because they're lazy, because they're no good, because they don't want, and so you can throw your arms to the side. There is poverty because it is structurally orchestrated. And because the resources and the wealth of countries like Peru, which is an extremely wealthy country resource-wise, is an immoral place to be. And that then formed a theology called liberationist theology, began to look at rereading the Bible from the standpoint of the poor. And the poor got that in their own hands, and they began to stand up for their rights. They became agents of their own destiny, and that caused huge problems. And for some in the Catholic Church at that time, like John Paul II, who was coming out of a very different context, began to question these people. Now, Gustavo was never vilified totally by Rome. He was never silenced by Rome. But once Pope Francis came into vogue, all that took on a new emphasis, as it is with the present Pope, in looking at the needs of migrants, refugees, the needs of the poor, the voice of the poor as being, an image of God. Like, if this is how you treat people, well, this is how you
I
treat.
think that's one of the difficulties with a global organization that tries to give a panacea to everybody, regardless of the context. I see you have a house, so to speak, in Kenya.
Mhm.
Well, I know in Africa, Sunday is an all-day spiritual event for Catholics,
Mhm.
so that people go. It's a family thing, it's a social thing, and Mass takes something like 2 hours,
That's right.
and everyone enjoys it, and the singing and the cultural input is huge, and it's a day that people look forward to. And of
Mhm.
course, I was surprised when I came to Ireland to be told, "Oh, we go to Father so and so because we're in and out in 20 minutes."
That's right. It's a completely, the context matters in everything, and but it's also around how liturgies are done, like when people don't put in, when I was in Peru, liturgy is very vibrant, it's very participative. It's not just the priest up there, because there's more equality. At least, like everywhere, there's differences. But in the parishes I worked in, and lay people are more involved in the running of their parishes. They're more involved in the organization. They're also trained to accompany the sick, to accompany people who are grieving. Theology is done for everybody, not just the religious people. Education and that. In Ireland, we have a long ways to go in that. And very often a priest is just up there, going through the liturgy as if it was just a shopping list. When
Yes.
people are in something that is meaningful, people stay.
Yeah.
They crave for that.
There are many inputs that have formed you and your sense of social justice and what have you. And so I see that Peru is an influence. I see Northern Ireland is an influence, or living on a border town is an influence. The involvement that you have in Ireland and also in Dublin with social activities, movements, and the whole ethos of your congregation. With all of that, what kind of lessons do you think that you have that acts as a solution or a series of solutions? I know you've mentioned some before, but is there anything additional from your experience in Peru and the remedies that were applied there, experience in the border town, experience in Dublin, Ireland, and elsewhere that you could, give us from your experience? It's a kind of vague kind of
But I
question.
like. I mean, I think one of the things that I always would say to people is because I grew up in a border town, and borders generally are political constructs. But
Mm.
I also learned that you can have borders in your mind and in your heart, and very
Right,
often they're harder to shift than the borders that are political constructs.
right.
That
That
if
is a one.
it's a
Yes,
border in your mind
yeah,
about who you are or whatever. The
yes.
other thing is that human beings are human beings.
Mm,
They're fragile. They're different. They can have all sorts of things, but humanity as a construct and humanity as people, when you bring people together,
mm,
things change and things can happen.
yes.
So creating communities, creating spaces for dealing with difference and dialogue works. When
Mm.
I see the pain in your eye and you see the pain in my eye, we're in a very different space.
Absolutely,
That is
absolutely.
one thing that I've learned, that when you really, with the person I really dislike,
Mm,
person I find really difficult around the table,
mm,
when we really sit, rather than my prejudice and my mind being constantly, well, I know they'll never do this, they'll never do that,
mm,
that you have to, and living as a religious in a community has taught me that so much.
yeah.
Community is not easy,
No,
but it works,
absolutely not.
and it kind of has, from the individual worlds that we are now predominantly, that it's me, I doesn't fulfill.
Mm,
And that the vacuums that people feel in life, even though we became a wealthier country in Ireland and people can have a standard of living that was beyond my dreams in my lifetime, when I grew up, that doesn't give you everything.
yes,
You don't have to have necessarily a religious faith belief
yeah,
to realize that, but people search for something deeper.
yeah. Well, the way we handle it, or if you want to put it that way, the way we approach it is that we recognize these borders.
Mm.
And because these internal borders are there, and are there with everybody, as you say, it's part of the humanity. And how to remove these borders is to have a deeper understanding of the human person, not just in terms of their difference of personality and history and the psychological accumulation that comes from that, which we all have, but also to have that penetrating vision, probably which Christ had, which went to the heart of every person and saw the unity of existence there, that Jesus described as the kingdom of heaven within. And so, and I think somebody in India, Mother Teresa, had that expression: "I'm seeing, I'm serving the Christ within." And that's an important thing. If we were all able to do that, of course, that would be a huge advance.
Yeah.
Sheila, I don't think we have time for anything more, but thank you. You gave us a wonderful ending to this, when you were comment about internal borders. I think that when it goes to the heart of everything. And I just thank you for um, privilege, making a privilege for us to have you and take part in this leading dialogues series of podcasts. So
Thank you very much,
thank
Swami,
you
for
so much.
inviting me. It was a pleasure to have a conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.